Neptune enters Aries for the first time in 165 years. This changes everything. April 2025 is the most important month of this year astrologically. The reason for that is Neptune is entering into Aries, and it doesn't change sign too often. It's changing sign on March 30th, right near the eclipse, which gives it much more power. And then also we have this ongoing Mars-Pluto opposition, which is hitting its third and final maximum spike later in April. That will be the subject more for next video. But if you want to learn more about Mars-Pluto, because it is very active right now, intensifying this entrance into Aries for Neptune. If you want to learn more about that, I'll put a link at the end of this video. You can check it out. I go into much greater detail. Let's start out more big picture here. We're now officially entering into phase 2 of a giant triple pulse of astrological energy as the 3 outermost planets are all changing signs within a few years of each other. Over the last 2 years, we've had Pluto going back and forth across the Capricorn-Aquarian frontier. It is now officially in Aquarius, where it will be until 2043. Now we have Neptune, phase 2, entering into Aries, where it will be for the next 14 years. And then about middle of next year, 2026, we have Uranus entering into Gemini. The 3 outermost planets do not change sign this closely to each other very often. It's actually very rare. And the implications are endless for humanity and for us individually. I've said this many times on my channel. During this 3-year period of time, we're going into hyperdrive regarding our growth and evolution, really as a species. And a line I've used before is by the end of 2027, it's going to be a whole new world. It's going to look radically different than the world we're in now. Is it a better world, a more utopian future, or a more dystopian future? Well, that depends on the decisions we make as a collective. Now, let's dive into Neptune and try to describe the most dreamy of all the planets and how it affects the collective. Neptune's a lot trickier to pin down. It's like trying to describe a dream you're still half inside of. Planets like Pluto or Uranus are more easily understood. Pluto, the so-called lord of the underworld, the god of hell, tends to dredge up all the pain from the unconscious, the shadow of humanity, and brings out the darkness to extremes. It also brings out the light to extremes as well. Now this sounds terrible, all the darkness coming out in full force. But it's actually a blessing because it reminds us what we still need to work on. Uranus, on the other hand, the god of earthquakes and lightning bolts, the planet of disruption and chaos and freedom and liberation and innovation, is a lot more obvious as well. Neptune operates in a much more misty, diffuse way, blurring edges and dissolving boundaries. It's the planet of imagination, illusion, spirituality, and escapism. So it tends to hit us a lot less like a hammer and more like a tide. Subtle, persuasive, and really hard to grasp until you're already soaked in it. On a practical level, Neptune affects how we feel as a group. Whether that's for unity, beauty, or a savior, it makes us idealize and romanticize to a fault. And Neptune's disruptions can kind of creep in, and it feels a lot less like aha moments and more like, wait, when did this become normal? Before we understand what Neptune in Aries means for us, it's always important to take a look back at the sign it's now leaving. It's been in Pisces since 2012. So as we contemplate the last 13 years, that evolutionary state of consciousness feeds into the current one. They're intimately interconnected. Neptune is always strongest when it's in the sign of Pisces because it rules that sign. We could call the last 13 years or so a spiritual renaissance. Neptune, the god of the sea, the metaphor for the sea of consciousness, in the sign of Pisces, the mystic. Now, spiritual renaissance, I mean, it's a little silly to think that we have an epidemic of enlightenment on planet Earth right now. I mean, that's kind of a joke. But in my opinion, a lot of people have been waking up. Now, why have they been waking up from the dream, the Maya, the illusion of it all? Because the average level of consciousness for humanity has raised substantially over the last 13 years. And when people's consciousness is higher, we become less vulnerable to, let's say, muddied perception of reality. And also, on that same vein, because the rising of our consciousness, Neptune in Pisces also brings about great art. Now, you really have to be up in the art scene to realize those gigantic leaps forward. I mean, you're certainly not going to see them on the Billboard Top 100 list, something like that. But there is great art, I know it, all over the planet, coming out in abundance over the last 13 years. And pay close attention to the children that were born over the last 13 years, because what they all have in common is they have Neptune in Pisces in their chart. We're going to have a lot of baby mystics and a lot of creative visionaries growing up as we, grow deeper into this age of Aquarius, and they're going to help us so much. We also don't want to shy away from the dark. One of the shadow sides of Neptune in Pisces is addiction, the archetype of the escape artist. The last 13 years has been an addiction epidemic. We're seeing, all the crisis with fentanyl and all this stuff coming up. So many overdoses because of this drug. But then even beyond that, just the addiction of technology. People cannot take their faces away from their screens. This is very common. Another great challenge is there has been lies everywhere. The shadow side of Neptune in Pisces is deception, lies, manipulation, and delusion. There has been a lot of delusional states of consciousness because there has been so many lies proliferated out into the world in this information age across the internet. Sprinkled with those lies, of course, are great truths. And there's been so many manipulative lies that it's almost becomes a joke. And this is a big reason why people are waking up as well. With Neptune, I like to use this metaphor. Imagine each of us is a small droplet of water from the vast ocean of consciousness. And when we're first born, we're clean slated. We have this pure droplet of water. But through the trials and tribulations of life and fear and egoism and anger and pride, all these things, impurities begin to cloud the droplet. Now, in many spiritual traditions, many believe fire, and Aries is a fire sign. Fire purifies. So that's a big picture approach to Neptune and Aries, and a good way to think about it is, okay, my droplet, my soul incarnate, my spiritual being having a finite experience has impurities. And how can I use the fire of Aries to cleanse myself as clean as I was when I was a child, so to speak? And there's ways to work with this on a personal level, but first, let's talk about this major transition for us as humanity. Let's start out with the great challenge, the fire that wants to burn the impurities of emotional states of consciousness that tend to be more destructive, that are related to the sign of Aries, known as the warrior archetype, which is basically fear and anger. While Neptune is in Aries, affecting how we feel as a collective, bringing out, at least on the darker side of things, we'll talk about the light in a little bit, but on the dark side, the low consciousness expression of the warrior is rage and fear. So here we have Neptune, which is related to the mystic archetype, known as the most spiritual of all the planets, in the sign of Aries, the warrior. So spiritual, or spirit, and warrior, we throw those in the cocktail shaker. Of course, we got the spiritual warrior archetype. And there'll be more on that later. But first, let's take that word spiritual warrior and say one of the major themes over the next 14 years is we're entering into a phase of spiritual warfare, the spiritual war at full intensity. This is the classic battle between good and evil. Also makes me think about the concept of religious zealotry. People who are very spiritual or religious, and if those religions are more vulnerable to anger, rage, egoism, okay, despair, and manifest in some of the fringes of these religions as extremism. I see religious extremism going bonkers in the coming years, going in kind of a battle rage mode. Now, there's good, of course, in all religions, or most religions, except for, like Satanism or something like that. And on that note, during spiritual warfare, the battle between good and evil, Satanism coming out in full battle dress. Now, Satanism is an extreme example, obviously. And they've been kind of lurking in the shadows for quite some time, but I see them becoming much more overt with their symbolism and just more aggressive and action-oriented in general. And similarly, talking about higher dimensions of reality here in the psychical and noetical planes, okay, which is part of spiritual warfare as well, demons and angels, this sort of thing. The lower astral entities also getting greatly agitated. But here's the good news, because that sounds terrible. I'm just pointing to some of the great challenges we're going to be facing. But the good news is darkness cannot withstand the light of the sun. And much like the darkness is coming out to a great degree, so too is the light. Neptune in Aries, another way we could describe it is as divine will. This is also connected to the archangels, the guardian spirits, the deities, the helper spirits, the invisible helpers. Now, during this time, much like we can be attacked by the lower astral entities, if we have something within us that calibrates at that same low level of consciousness as them, that's the only way they can affect us, is if they co-vibrate with the darkness that already exists within us. So that can be a great challenge. But then we have the guardian spirits, the archangel, orders and stuff like this. They go by different names. It depends on the mystical culture we're talking about. But there's this sense of, as humanity, we're playing for high stakes during this spiritual warfare. And if we go too far off track, we can also experience what the Cypriot mystic Stylianos Ateshlis called the sting of consciousness. Our guardian archangel, as he described it, if we go too far off course, we'll receive that whip or that sting. It's not a form of punishment, it's a balancing to remind us of the true path, to remind us of the light that should outshine the dark if expressed and gone down that way. Now, one of the archetypes for Aries is the survivalist. It's also the sign linked to new beginnings and going in new directions. Now, because we're in this Aquarian age, plus Pluto in Aquarius cementing us into this new age, very much this is connected to technology and AI, of course. And on that note, because of AI, the job markets and the economy is going to be changing rapidly, especially over the next couple years. So we need to be more adaptable and to survive to structures we've been used to, which with Neptune in the sign will begin to dissolve right before our very eyes. So this will require many folks to leverage decisive warrior action and to be bold and courageous as you go in new directions, as you adapt with the ever-changing year-by-year times that we find ourselves in. And one last thing I want to say about collective and how we're influenced is more specific to April, where Neptune in Aries also ignites collective movements. Usually these movements are motivated by fear and anger and pride and rage. Okay, but some will also be motivated by courage, bravery, willpower, and decisive action. Okay, every expression of every planet and symbol has a higher octave expression and a lower one, and there will be an abundance of both. So in April, look for massive collective movements across the globe. Now, I'm American, so what immediately comes to mind for me is on April 2nd, that's when Trump does all the reciprocal tariffs. That's when the trade wars start. I think he's calling it Liberation Day. Liberation, the liberation of the warrior, it resonates with the sign of Aries. And I get the sense that he's kind of in warrior mode, protective mode, because that's the part of the Aries archetype, is to be the protector of the weak and defenseless. And he feels he's in protector mode, or as many people think, he's just a liar. Maybe he's being dishonest. I mean, he's such a divisive figure. So you got half the country believing he's a liar, the other half of the country, really encouraged and motivated by his warrior mode. Who is right? Well, it depends on the average level of consciousness of each collective group. Which one is more motivated by anger and rage, and which one is more motivated by protection, decisive action, and bravery? There'll be differing opinions on both sides to that question. You laugh or you cry, but that's where we're at. And because of these trade wars, I think they've selected, 15 primary countries that they perceive as doing us dirty, regarding trade. It's going to create a lot of fear, anger, rage, and pride, and a lot of hissy fits from a lot of people and countries. And this will be really strong at the beginning of the month, around April 2nd, when this first starts, and I'd probably say the week thereafter. And then it'll hit another peak spike. It'll hit a culmination point at the last week of April, again, when the Mars hits that exact opposition with Pluto. That is an intense event. Now, as an evolutionary astrologer, where my heart is really at with this work, is how can we work with these events on a personal level for our own betterment and evolution? And this is what I focus on in my counseling work with my clients. For these YouTube videos, I like to do a combination of both because it's useful. Knowing is half the battle. What's going to go on out there? What's the larger calling for us as humanity? And then also be aware of the type of behavior that will be intensified so we can kind of sidestep that drama. But then it's like, okay, in my personal life, what actions can I take? And Aries always favors action. What actions can I take for my own Neptunian spiritual evolution? And again, with Neptune, it's always about how can I purify my droplet, so to speak? How can I purify my human personality so that more of my soul can shine through? I talked about Stylianos Ateshlis a bit ago. He's the Cypriot Christian mystic, one of my favorite. I study his work all the time. And he talked a lot about what are called elementals. We have elementals within our subconsciousness, which are alive within us. They're not beings. We're beings, but they are entities that are alive within our bodies, mental, emotional, and physical bodies. They're alive because we've created them, because we're an extension of the divine. We are creators. Now, do we choose to create what he called demonic elementals within our subconsciousness, creating those more negative, low consciousness habit patterns, which grow more powerful the more we allow them expressed? Or do we create more angelic elementals in our subconsciousness, which already really exists there because that's an extension of our divinity, our soul energy? So he really stressed the whole process of spiritual development is slowly over time dissolving that which is demonic within us as you empower that which is angelic within us. And if you have more demonic, more powerful elementals, that creates an opaqueness that blocks your soul energy, your lifeline. Whereas if you dissolve those and empower the angels, so to speak, then over time you develop a more saintly, translucent, luminous personality. Now with Aries, again, the elementals associated with this sign, the demonic ones, are primarily anger and rage, as well as fear. And there's many mystical traditions that stress the importance of how dangerous and destructive anger is. And many people, because of egoism, and egoism is so cunning, we grow a certain level of attachment to our anger because it's not anger, right? It's righteous indignation. I feel justified. I've been wrong. I've been victimized to express this anger, but it's a destructive emotion at its core. It will always foster the growth of more ignorance and misunderstanding, which is the path to pain and suffering and creating more of that. So these mystical traditions will often focus on dissolving the anger elementals within. They probably won't describe it that way, but that's basically the essence of the process. And there's many meditation techniques and styles of doing that, which I won't get into here, but basically just becoming more aware of that which triggers your anger. And in meditative states, you can analyze an event you had in that day of your life when you got really angry and observe it from a place of detached observation and study it. And ask yourself, what part of me got angry about this? Did my soul get angry about this? Or the impurities of the droplet, meaning my egoism within my human personality, and to study it and consciously choose something else next time in the future. And the next time, as you pivot away from that anger, instead of allowing expression, it goes back into your subconsciousness weaker. And next time when it gets triggered, it won't be as strong. And this is why Daskalos or Stylianos of Teslas called it dissolving the demonic elementals, which takes a little bit of work each day over the course of the life. Now, returning to the core archetype of Neptune and Aries, the spiritual warrior. During this time, it's most helpful to do spiritual warrior things or commit to the spiritual warrior path, to face your fears along the spiritual path, to do scary things along your spiritual journey. Here's a scary spiritual experience for a lot of folks: psychedelics. It's not everybody's cup of tea. It certainly is in the Neptune and Aries category. But what happens when you do that is the ego kind of dissolves. It steps out of the way so you can do the deep inner work. And many people report after such an experience that they're far less angry or fearful, or whatever elementals they've been really struggling with are no longer as strong after they do those journeys. That's one option. There's another scary thing for a lot of folks, spiritual experience: having an out-of-body experience. There's a guy online who trains people how to consciously leave your body. I think his name is Darius. I'm not trying to promote his work. There's a lot of people that teach it. But I listened to him talk about it, and one of the things he talked about is the first time you leave your body after you do the training, it's very scary. And that's because when you leave your body for the first time, it's not that there's necessarily anything creepy there. Okay? I mean, there is some stuff in the lower astral planes, okay, but it can't really hurt you that much unless you invite it in. But the reason why when people have an out-of-body experience like that for the first time, they're scared so much, sometimes so much that they don't repeat it again. I don't want to go there again. But it's all an illusion. When you leave your body, the reason why it's so scary for a lot of folks is because they're confronted with their own demonic elementals, which are within their own field. And once they realize these were self-created entities, and they develop their warrior courage and divine will, they can tell those entities to part ways, and they will. Neptune in Aries, we could say consciousness pioneering would be another phrase we could use. Psychedelics, out-of-body training, definitely qualifies as such. So too is electing to go on a vision quest. Maybe you fast for 3 days, you go out in the desert, all you got's water and the animals making strange noises. That can be scary too. Also with Aries, I love the idea and the spiritual process working with fire. A lot of those shamanic traditions believe that fire, they use for the sweat lodges, which is a Neptune and Aries activity too. Fire purifies the droplet. This also makes me think of meditation techniques that are more active and dynamic instead of quiet, sitting, and quiescent, that involve movement and breath matched with visualization and intention, such as Qigong, or anything really that works with ether, getting the energy moving through the body. That can help too with anger and fear. It's like, let's move it out. Qigong's great for that. Or meditation practices that work with fire, or Kundalini fire, or as some of the Christian mystics called it, baptism by fire, where you're working with that sacred creative life force, okay, running it up and down the spine, which can be scary for some people because some people report having really negative experiences with Kundalini awakening. So you want to approach that with caution if you choose to, and with proper training. But that's a spiritual warrior path too. The bottom line is that Neptune in Aries is about spiritual breakthroughs that require courage. That's the key line there. And if we talk about Neptune going through Pisces, okay, the raising of our consciousness over the last 13 or 14 years, as Neptune has been doubled in strength then, leading up to where we are now, to take all that raising of consciousness, that spiritual accrued wisdom, and now take decisive action forward in the world, boldly, courageously, to enter into action, to teach, to share, and to continue the momentum of the spiritual development we've been experiencing. These are the core evolutionary intentions, with the goal being to expand our consciousness.